Good morning. It is certainly good to see more and more back, and just such an encouragement. And I know that there's some here today that either haven't been here or they haven't been here for a while, so it's great to see them as well. It was baseball legend Frank Robinson who, back in 1973, during the World Series, he was kind of credited with coining the phrase that close doesn't count in baseball. Close only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades. And we've probably lived by that, but for just about every day of our life, with that, sometimes close does not come close enough. But I want to kind of bring that into the religious arena, because I think that is such an important aspect of when we start thinking spiritually in our lives and wanting to get to heaven, just really how important that whole saying really can be. But I want to do this with looking at an Old Testament figure today named Saul. And if you can turn to 1 Samuel, that's primarily where we're going to be this morning. Saul was a king. In fact, he was the first king of the Israelites in quite some time. And if you remember, back in 1 Samuel chapter 8, beginning in verse 4, Saul, all the elders of Israel gathered together. They come to Samuel at Ramah, and they said to him, "Look, you're old and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations." These elders had the wrong idea to begin, but they were looking around at everything around them, at all the nations around, and it seemed like the grass was always greener, for everyone else who had these kings. And they tell Samuel, "We want to be just like them." Well, Samuel, was mindful and attentive to what would have taken place. God tells Samuel, "This is what I want you to tell them. If they choose this way," and there was a warning that came with this, if they choose a king, then this is what the kings are going to do, because this is what they didn't look at. Everything seems so glorious with all these other places. But God said, if they get a king, you tell them, here's what's going to happen. That king is going to take every bit of their land. He's going to own their property. He's going to put their men to work. He's going to put their women to work. And he's essentially going to own everything, their lives and their livelihood. They're not going to be able to think for themselves. They're not going to be able to do anything for themselves. But if they want that king that bad, then I'll give it to him. Well, Samuel goes and relays this to the elders, and the elders essentially said, "We don't care. We want a king like everyone else." And so sure enough, he said, "Okay." God said, "Okay." And a man named Saul filled that position. Saul was such a hot and cold king. He did exactly what Samuel warned them would happen. Saul was disobedient more times than not. He was impulsive. He was paranoid. He was always worried about people taking his position. And he came close sometimes to gaining favor with the Lord. As you read through his account, and you can do this all through 1 Samuel, it talks a great deal about Saul. Basically what would happen is Samuel, he would be doing things and it would backfire on him, and Samuel would tell him how, he needs to get close to God, and something else would happen. And so there have been several, and he would say, "Okay, well, I'll pray to God." And then he'd fall right back into what he was doing before. And he came close several times to gain favor with God. But if I want to reach heaven, is close enough? And that's what we need to ask ourselves. If what I'm doing in life right now, if I want to reach heaven, but I emulate the world, I might get close, but it's close enough to get me there. And so we move forward to chapter 15 in 1 Samuel. And so, time goes on. People are, it's known to the people that they would get this king. And in chapter 15, it says, Samuel also said to Saul, "The Lord sent me to anoint you king." So he knew he was going to become king. And Samuel has more instruction for him and more warning to him. He says, "The Lord sent me to anoint you king over his people and over Israel. And now, therefore, heed the voice of the words of the Lord. And so God anoints him as king, but what that also means is that God could remove him as king. And he was going to find that out in the most harshest of ways. You look at verse 2, and it says, "Thus saith the Lord of hosts, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel, how he ambushed him on the way when he came up from Egypt. And now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." I want to pause right there because this goes all the way back to Exodus with what he's talking about right here. Remember that at that time, when you look all the way back, the Israelites had escaped Egypt. God had gotten them that far. And then after escaping Egypt, God leads them through the Red Sea. They got that far, and they were able to escape the Pharaoh. But along their journey, they're ambushed at a place called Rephidim. And at Rephidim, it was the Amalekites that had attacked them. Now, the Amalekites were known to be a very warring people. They were very idolatrous people. And they certainly stood against God with things that they practiced. And they'd continually attacked Israel. Well, when you look back, if you hold your place there, you look back at Exodus chapter 17 and verse 14, God finally had enough of this, and he tells them, "I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek." And so he gives this promise to Moses and all of the people. And of course, it didn't happen right away. Several years had passed, but God would dispense justice in his time. Flash forward back to Saul, hundreds of years later. God comes to Saul, who would have the power by that time to be able to finally destroy the Amalekites the way that God had promised the Israelites way back then. But his instruction to them was, I don't want you to leave anything unturned. This is not the first time God said, I want everything completely destroyed. Remember, he told Joshua going into Canaan, I want everything destroyed. And it seems really harsh because he's talking about the men and the women and the children, and we think, what a sadistic God. A lot of people in the world think, what a sadistic God that must be. To say, to order the death of everyone and to just wipe out literally an entire people like that. But you consider the kind of people that they were. They could not be reached. They didn't listen to anyone. They were not following the way that God wanted people to follow. And God knew that if those people stayed the way that they were and other people started to be influenced by them, you can see where that would go. And God said, I don't want any of that, because as God commanded so many times before, he says, I am the only God that you should be worshiping. He told Moses this long before this. In fact, it was part of the commandments that he gave them, that I am God and there is to be no other God beside me. There is to be no other God in front of me. You do not worship those. You give those idols up. You give that kind of worship up. Anything that is going to stand in the way of you and me, you need to put out of your life. And of course, there were a lot of people that didn't do that. And so the Amalekite, God tells him, I want you to completely eliminate the Amalekites. Well, the Amalekites had a king. His name was Agag. And Agag was powerful. He had a lot of influence back then. And Saul, being the king over the Israelites, being given this command, we see how Saul was victorious in his campaign, so it seemed. When you look at chapter 15 and verse 4 of 1 Samuel, it says, Saul gathered the people together, and he numbered them in Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers, 10,000 men of Judah, and so he had an army that was very impressive. Saul came to a city of Amalek and lay in wait in the valley. And when you look at verse 7, it says, Saul attacked the Amalekites, and from Havilah all the way to Shur, which is east of Egypt. And so it seems like he attacks them and he destroys so many of them, conquered the land, conquered the people, and he thought he was close enough. But was he? You look at verse 8, it says he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag, and the best of the sheep, and the oxen, and the fatlings, the lambs, and all that was good, and were unwilling to utterly destroy them, but everything despised and worthless that they utterly destroyed. And so you notice right here, the command of God was to remove everything. He said, I want you to go in and basically lay waste to that. And that was a popular thing back then. When you would war against other people or war against other nations, the reason why you would just completely destroy everything is so that they could not be remembered. Basically, what you're doing is wiping them from history, so that so you wouldn't have any record at all of what those people would do. And God said, that's exactly what I want you to do. But you notice what they did. God's command was, to remove all. But what happened? They leave Agag, the king, alive. Again, he's disobedient. They leave, they destroy everything that was worthless or what they thought was worthless. But they said, no, we're going to take Agag. We're going to take all of the best of their cattle and their livestock. We're going to take the best of of what they have and their possessions, and then we'll just throw the rest of it away. Well, this doesn't sit well with Samuel, obviously. And when you look at verse 10, it says, the word of the Lord came to Samuel, saying, I greatly regret that I have set up Saul as king. Now, when God says, I regret something, it basically means that he's changing his will. He's saying, I want something different in place. God said, remember, God, we see this word a couple of times in the Old Testament. We see it back when the people were so wicked that there was going to be a global flood, and God said, I regret making these people. It doesn't mean that God changed his mind, or that he just thought that he himself was wrong for doing something. That's not God. But he says, my will is going to change. And that's exactly what he did. Remember, Saul was going to be anointed king. God said, okay, you put him in there, but this is what's going to happen. And God said, okay, here it is. But now God's rejecting him. He's saying he's not doing what he should be doing. He's not doing what Samuel told him to do. He's not doing what he knew he should be doing. And he says, I greatly regret that I have set up Saul as king, for he has turned back from following me, and he has not performed my commandments. And it grieved Samuel, and he cried out to the Lord all night. And so when Samuel rose early in the morning to meet Saul, it was told Samuel, saying, Saul went to Carmel, and indeed he set up a monument for himself, and has gone on around, passed by, and gone down to Gilgal. And Samuel went to Saul, and Saul said to him, well, blessed are you of the Lord. I performed the commandment of the Lord. What a snake. But Samuel said, oh, really? You see, Saul knew what the command was. And Samuel goes down to meet him to see why Agag is still alive, why all of these different things that they were supposed to destroy, why they still have them in their possession. And Samuel, when he goes to him, Saul says, hey, guess what? I did everything that I was supposed to do with this. But when you look at verse 14, Samuel said, oh, really? What? Well, what then? There's this bleating of the sheep in my ears and the lowing of the oxen, which I hear. If you did exactly what God told you to do, why do I hear sheep bleating? Why do I hear all these animals that are still around? And Saul essentially gave himself up with his guilt. If you really obeyed the Lord. And verse 15 is very telling right here. Because it's something, and it's why we're looking at this morning. It is something that so many people are guilty of when we try to start reasoning how close to God we think we are. And it's why we need to be so careful. Look at verse 15. And then we're going to read 18 through 21 right here. Saul said to Samuel, well, they have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and the oxen to sacrifice to the Lord your God, and the rest we have utterly destroyed. So he's saying, at least we did this. He says, we were supposed to destroy we at least kept Agag, and we at least kept all the good stuff. And then when you look at verse 18, Samuel says to him, well, now the Lord sent you on a mission. And he says, that's not what he commanded you to do. He said, the Lord sent you on a mission and said, go and what? Utterly destroy the sinners. Utterly destroy the Amalekites. Fight against them until they are consumed. And why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why did you swoop down on the spoil and do evil in the sight of the Lord? And listen to what Saul says again. Saul said to Samuel, but I've obeyed the voice of the Lord. I've gone on the mission of which the Lord sent me. I brought back Agag, the king of Amalek. I've utterly destroyed the Amalekites. But the people took of the plunder and the sheep and the oxen and the best of the things which should have been utterly destroyed to sacrifice to the Lord your God in Gilgal. See, what he was doing right here is compartmentalizing. He was saying, I know what God said, but look at what we did right here. That's what compartmentalizing is. We're saying, I know what God said. I know what the command is. But you know what? I'm going to put that over here, and at least we're doing this. Friends, it's sad when people start trying to reason this way. It's a common response, though. At least I did this. When Jesus was talking to his apostles, and he said, I want you to go out into the world, and he tells them, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. That is the only way that I'm going to get to heaven. I can't get to heaven if I'm not saved. And Jesus said the only way to be saved is to believe in him and to be baptized, which implies that if I don't believe or if I'm not baptized, I'm not going to be saved. And if I'm not saved, I'm not going to heaven. I have no chance. That's what we need to get the world to believe today. But what happens? People say, well, you know what? I've done this and I've done this. I go to church. I read my Bible. I'm a good person. I've donated to this charity, or I've done, this for other people, and that's great. But are you obeying the will of God? You see, that's what he wants. That's what means something to him. I can try to tell people all day how good, I think I've been, but how am I demonstrating it? You see, good means that I'm going to obey him. Good means that I'm going to do his will. Good means that I'm going to look at what's in the Bible about certain things. I'm going to say, this is how I'm going to live my life. And Saul should have recognized that. He said, I know what the command of God was, but at least, we spared Agag, and we spared all these different cattle, we spared all these different things, but you know why we did that? Because we're going to give it to God anyway. Isn't that good enough? Saul almost did what the Lord commanded, but not all. And when you look at verse 22, Samuel tells him, has the Lord a great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices, as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey, listen to this, because this is exactly what we need to do today. This is the same principle today. We're not giving him all the livestock and everything like they did, but the same principle is designed for us today to follow this pattern, this way of thinking. He says, behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. Because look at this in verse 23. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft. He's comparing these sins now. He says rebellion is no different than the sin of witchcraft. And stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. He's saying, you can be as good as you want. You can almost get there. But if you're not following him, a lot of people think, you know what, I can worship this way or this way or this way. We have a lot of churches doing that. But what did God tell us to do? How did God tell us to worship him? He said, stubbornness is iniquity and idolatry, because you have rejected the word of the Lord, and he also has rejected you from being king. See, when following God's instruction, close is not close enough. And we need to be very attentive to that. Well, when you look at verse 24, it says, Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned, for I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord and your words, because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. And now therefore, please pardon my sin and return with me that I may worship the Lord. But look at what Samuel says right here to him. I'm not going to return with you, for you've rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel. This was, right here was that pivotal moment that would lead to David being anointed as king. And we know the jealousy that Saul had of David. And then we see something interesting in verse 32. It says, Samuel said, bring Agag, king of the Amalekites, here to me. You didn't do it right. You almost did it right, but you didn't do it right because you didn't go far enough. He says, bring the Agag, the king, to me. And so Agag came to him cautiously. I believe the American Standard Version renders that he came trembling to him. He knew something was going on. And Agag said, surely the bitterness of death is past. But Samuel said, as your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women. And Samuel, this gets kind of graphic right here, Samuel hacked Agag into pieces before the Lord in Gilgal. That's how it should have been handled. Because Agag was not a good king. He was an evil, manipulative king that led the people into all the ways they shouldn't have been. I may get close to being saved without baptism. I may get close to being saved without repentance. That's not close enough. And as a Christian who does not live faithfully, a Christian who turns to the world for their fellowship, as Jim mentioned this morning, Katie and I have some good friends whose daughter, who we've known for years and love her. We've known her since she was before she was a teenager. Decided to take up fellowship with the world and left the Lord. That happened this week. She broke her mother's heart. And she broke her father's heart. And those who have had children and have seen that happen know how emotional and how deeply that can hit you. We pray for her daily. But a Christian who does not live faithfully and turns to the world for fellowship is no closer to heaven than someone who's not been baptized at all. That's why we need to try to win people back so we can get them to go to heaven and love them enough. And it sometimes can be hard with how we treat them and what we say to them, but we need to do it because we love them enough to and care for them enough to do it. The only way to reach the ark of safety is to follow God completely. Maybe you're close to obeying the gospel. I don't know what everyone's spiritual state is in here. Maybe you're close to obeying the gospel. Or maybe you're close to living how you know that you should, but you're not there yet. Let's take care of it this morning. Let's take care of it this morning. As we have the song of invitation, I want to ask you that if you do need prayers to turn your life around, please don't hesitate to come forward. We don't need to know details. We want to be able to have this opportunity to pray for you. Let's stand and sing.